The note. The sun cast a warm golden glow over the quiet suburban park, but Raina felt no comfort in its light. She sat alone on the rusted swing, her small frame barely causing it to sway. Her sneakers brushed against the dirt, tracing aimless patterns. At only 10 years old, Raina carried a burden far too heavy for her small shoulders. Her dark eyes, wide and alert, darted between the trees, her nervous glances betraying the fear she tried so hard to mask. Officer Ben Hartman was making his routine patrol of the neighborhood, a place where nothing seemed to happen. The houses were lined neatly, each yard a mirror of the last. Lawns were meticulously trimmed, and children played without a care. But as his patrol car turned the corner near the park, his gaze was drawn to the solitary figure sitting by the swings. Something about the way she held herself, a mixture of tension and fragility, stirred an instinct in him. Ben parked the car and stepped out, the sound of his boots crunching on the gravel breaking the silence. His movements were deliberate, his voice calm as he called out, "Hey there, young lady. Everything okay?" Raina froze, her small hands gripping the chain of the swing tightly. Her body tensed, as though ready to bolt. Ben raised his hands slightly, palms outward, a universal gesture of peace. "It's all right," he said gently. "My name's Officer Ben. I'm here to help." Her eyes flicked to the shiny badge pinned to his chest, then back to his face. She didn't respond. Ben took a slow step closer, crouching down to her level. He could see the fear in her expression, a wariness that seemed far too practiced for someone her age. "What's your name?" he asked softly. After a moment of hesitation, she whispered, "Raina." "That's a beautiful name," Ben said with a warm smile. "Raina, do you live around here? Are you lost?" Raina shook her head, but didn't elaborate. Her fingers twisted the hem of her faded t-shirt, and her lower lip trembled. Ben's chest tightened. He had seen this look before, long ago, in the eyes of his daughter Emily, before it was too late to help her. The memory hit him like a punch to the gut, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. "Raina," he said after regaining his composure, "if there's something wrong, you can tell me. I promise I'll do everything I can to help." For a fleeting moment, Raina looked like she might speak. But then she looked down, her lips pressing into a thin line. Ben didn't push. He had learned through years of experience that patience often achieved more than force. "I'll tell you what," he said, standing up slowly. "If you ever need help, you can always find me or another officer. That's what we're here for." He turned to leave, his heart heavy with the knowledge that he couldn't force her to open up. He was almost at his car when he felt a light tug on his pant leg. He turned to see Raina standing behind him, her expression a mixture of determination and fear. Before he could say anything, she slipped a small piece of paper into the pocket of his jacket and ran off, her small feet pounding against the pavement. "Raina, wait." Ben called after her, but she was already disappearing into the line of trees on the far side of the park. Ben reached into his pocket and pulled out the note, his brow furrowing as he unfolded it. The paper was crumpled, the edges smudged with dirt. Scrawled across it in shaky, uneven letters were two simple words: "Help me." Ben stood frozen, the note clutched in his trembling hand. The words stared back at him, small but urgent, carrying the weight of a desperate plea. He turned his gaze back toward the trees, but Raina was gone, swallowed by the shadows. A chill ran down his spine, not from the cold, but from the haunting familiarity of the situation. He had seen this before. Emily, his sweet Emily, had left a note too, one he found too late. "I'm sorry, Dad. I can't do this anymore. I love you." Those words had shattered him, and the guilt had clung to him like a shadow ever since. He had missed the signs, been too wrapped up in his own grief to see the pain his daughter was hiding. But this time, it would be different. Ben climbed back into his patrol car, the note still in his hand. He couldn't shake the image of Raina's frightened eyes or the weight of the two words she had written. The urgency in her message was clear. She was in trouble, and she had turned to him for help. As he started the engine, his mind raced with questions. Who was Rena? Why was she alone in the park? What had driven her to write that note and slip it into his pocket instead of speaking to him directly? The possibilities were endless, each more troubling than the last. Ben knew he had to act quickly. If Rena was in danger, every second counted. He drove toward the station, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. Once there, he would start piecing together the puzzle, find out who Rena was, where she lived, and what had led her to seek his help in such a cryptic way. But as he drove, a thought gnawed at the edges of his mind. What if he was already too late? At the station, Ben spread the note out on his desk, staring at it as if the words might rearrange themselves and offer more clues. He pulled up a database search, entering the description of the girl. Approximately 10 years old, black, braided hair, wearing a faded pink t-shirt and sneakers. He cross-referenced her name, Rena, with local school records and child welfare cases, hoping for a match. The minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an hour. Finally, a result popped up. A 5th grader named Rena Harris, enrolled at Willow Creek Elementary. Ben's heart leaped. He jotted down the school's contact information and address, then grabbed his jacket. As he prepared to leave, his eyes fell on the photograph on his desk, a picture of his wife and daughter taken years ago, before everything fell apart. Emily's smile was bright and carefree, her eyes full of life. He touched the edge of the frame, his voice a whisper. "I won't let it happen again." With renewed determination, Ben headed out. He didn't know what he would find, but he knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't let Rena down. Not like he had let Emily down. This time, he would fight with everything he had to make sure that this little girl, whoever she was, got the help she needed. The search begins. Ben's patrol car sped down the quiet streets, the flashing lights casting eerie patterns on the cookie-cutter houses and empty sidewalks. The park where he had met Rena was already a distant memory, but her desperate plea was fresh in his mind. "Help me." The weight of those 2 words pressed on him like a physical burden, a stark reminder of the fragility of life and his duty to protect it. The address he had found for Rena Harris wasn't far, a small duplex on the outskirts of the neighborhood. As he approached, Ben's eyes scanned the area. The street was eerily silent, the kind of quiet that made him uneasy. A few cars were parked along the curb, and one of the houses had Christmas lights still up, though it was nearly March. The duplex stood at the end of the row, its peeling paint and overgrown yard giving it a neglected appearance. Ben parked the car and stepped out, his boots crunching against the gravel driveway. The air was crisp, and the faint scent of wood smoke lingered. He approached the front door, his hand hovering over the badge clipped to his belt. He knocked firmly, but not aggressively. 3 short raps that echoed in the stillness. Seconds stretched into what felt like minutes. Just as Ben was about to knock again, the door creaked open. A woman stood in the doorway, her face tired and drawn. She looked to be in her late 30s, with deep lines etched into her brow and shadows under her eyes. Her hair was tied back in a messy bun, and she wore an oversized sweater that hung loosely from her frame. "Yes?" she asked, her voice guarded. Her eyes darted to Ben's uniform and badge. "Ma'am, I'm Officer Ben Hartman," he began, keeping his tone neutral but firm. "I'm looking for Rena Harris. Is she home?" The woman's expression shifted, just slightly, but enough for Ben to notice. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and her gaze flickered past him, as though checking for others. "Why do you need to see her?" she asked, her voice tight. Ben held up the note, the crumpled paper still smudged from Rena's small hands. "She gave me this earlier today. It's a cry for help. I need to make sure she's safe." The woman's eyes widened for a split second before she masked her reaction. She crossed her arms over her chest, blocking the doorway more fully. "She's fine," she said quickly, almost too quickly. "She's just a kid, probably playing some kind of game." Ben's instincts kicked in. Years of police work had taught him to recognize when someone was lying, and this woman's behavior screamed of it. He kept his face neutral but didn't back down. "Ma'am, I understand that kids sometimes make mistakes or exaggerate," he said calmly, "but it's my job to investigate any signs of danger. If Rena is here, I need to see her." The woman hesitated, her gaze flickering again. This time, Ben followed her eyes. Through the crack in the door, he caught a glimpse of a narrow hallway and a small shoe rack near the wall. On the top row sat a pair of sneakers, pink with frayed laces, the same shoes Rena had been wearing at the park. "She's not here," the woman said, her voice sharpening. "Now, if you don't mind." Before she could close the door, a sound from inside stopped her, a soft, muffled thump, like something being knocked over. Ben's eyes narrowed. "Ma'am," he said, his voice firm now, "I'm going to have to ask you to step aside." The woman's face flushed, her demeanor shifting from defensive to combative. "You can't just barge into my house," she snapped. "Actually, I can if I believe a child is in immediate danger," Ben countered. He stepped forward, placing a hand on the door to prevent her from closing it. "And right now, I have serious concerns about Rena's safety. Please don't make this harder than it needs to be." For a moment, it looked like the woman might push back, but then her shoulders slumped. She stepped aside reluctantly, muttering under her breath. Ben entered the house, his senses on high alert. The air inside was heavy, carrying a faint metallic smell that made him uneasy. "Rena," he called out, his voice echoing down the dimly lit hallway. "It's Officer Ben. I'm here to help." There was no response, but Ben didn't miss the way the woman tensed behind him. He moved further into the house, his eyes scanning every corner. The living room was cluttered but not overtly suspicious, just the usual signs of a busy household. But as he reached the hallway, a door at the far end caught his attention. It was slightly ajar, and faint scratches marred the surface near the handle. Ben approached cautiously, his hand instinctively resting on the holster at his side. He pushed the door open slowly, revealing a small bedroom. The space was cramped, with a twin bed pushed against the wall and a desk covered in papers and half-empty water bottles. On the bed sat Rena, her knees drawn up to her chest and her arms wrapped tightly around them. "Rena," Ben said softly, relief flooding through him. Her head snapped up and her wide eyes met his. For a moment, she looked like she might bolt, but then recognition flickered across her face. Ben crouched down, bringing himself to her level. "It's okay," he said gently. "You're safe now." Rena's gaze darted past him to the woman standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable. Ben followed her line of sight and noticed the tension in Rena's small frame. She wasn't just scared, she was terrified. "Rena," Ben said, keeping his voice calm but firm, "can you tell me what's going on? Why did you give me that note?" Rena hesitated, her small hands gripping the fabric of her jeans. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "She's not my mom." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Ben's stomach dropped. He turned to the woman, who now looked pale, her defensive mask cracking under the weight of Rena's revelation. "What is she talking about?" Ben demanded. The woman stammered, her hands trembling. "She's lying. She's my niece. She's just confused." Ben's sharp gaze didn't waver. "Step out of the room," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. As the woman retreated, Ben turned back to Rena. He placed a reassuring hand on the bed, keeping his movements slow and non-threatening. "Rena," he said, "I need you to tell me the truth. Who is that woman, and why are you here?" Tears welled in Rena's eyes, and she hugged her knees tighter. "She took me," she whispered. She said if I told anyone, she'd hurt my brother." Ben's blood ran cold. Every fiber of his being screamed to act, but he forced himself to stay calm for Rena's sake. "Where is your brother?" he asked gently. Rena hesitated before replying. "I don't know. She said he's in another house." Ben nodded, his mind already racing with plans. He stood and pulled out his radio, signaling for backup. He wouldn't let this woman, or whoever else was involved, get away with this. As he stepped back into the hallway, he locked eyes with the woman, his voice cold and unwavering. "You've got a lot to answer for." Raina's quiet sobs followed him as he prepared to uncover the full scope of what was happening, and to bring her and her brother to safety. Ben didn't waste time as the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. He stepped into the hallway, his sharp gaze locking onto the woman, who had retreated near the doorway. Her posture was defensive, her eyes darting nervously as though weighing her options for escape. "Sit down," Ben ordered, his tone cold and commanding. The authority in his voice left no room for argument. She hesitated, but the flicker of defiance in her eyes was quickly extinguished as Ben took a step closer. She shuffled into the living room and sank into the worn couch, her hands gripping the edge of the cushion tightly. Ben pressed the radio on his shoulder. "This is Officer Ben Hartman, requesting immediate backup at 47 Linwood Street. Possible child abduction in progress. Send Child Protective Services as well." The woman's eyes widened at the mention of backup, and her breathing grew heavier. "You're making a mistake," she said quickly, her voice a mix of desperation and defiance. "I didn't do anything wrong. Raina is just confused. You don't understand." Ben ignored her for the moment, his mind focused on the most pressing matter, Raina's brother. If what she had said was true, there was another child out there who needed saving. And time was not on his side. "Raina," he said gently, stepping back into the bedroom where the young girl remained curled up on the bed. "I need you to help me, okay? Can you tell me everything you remember? Where did she take you from? How long have you been here?" Raina sniffled, wiping her face with the sleeve of her shirt. I don't know how long," she admitted, her voice trembling. "Maybe a week. I was at the park with my brother. We were playing, and she said she had puppies in her car. Denzel, he's my brother. He wanted to see them." Ben's jaw tightened. The thought of these children being lured away so easily by such a classic and cruel trick made his stomach churn. He forced himself to remain calm for Raina's sake. "She took us both," Raina continued, her words tumbling out faster now. "She said we'd get to see the puppies, but there weren't any. She locked us in different rooms. I don't know where Denzel is now. She says bad things will happen if I don't listen." Ben knelt beside her, his voice steady. "I promise you, Raina, we're going to find your brother. And we're going to keep you both safe. Do you know anything about where he might be? Did you hear anything? Any sounds, voices, or names?" Raina shook her head, her small hands clutching her knees. "No, but..." She hesitated, her brows furrowing. "When she talks on the phone, she always says a name. Mr. Clyde. I think that's who has Denzel." Ben's mind raced. A name was more than he had hoped for, a lead he could pursue. He stood and turned back to the woman in the living room. Her posture was rigid, her eyes watching him warily. "Who's Mr. Clyde?" Ben demanded, his voice low and firm. The woman shook her head, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I don't know what you're talking about." Ben crossed his arms, his eyes narrowing. "You think this is a game? A little girl is telling me her brother is being held by someone named Mr. Clyde, and you're involved. This is your chance to cooperate. If you don't, things are only going to get worse for you." The woman's face twisted in frustration, her earlier confidence cracking under the pressure. "I don't know where he is. Okay. Clyde. He's in charge. He makes all the decisions. I just keep an eye on Raina." Ben's temper flared, but he kept it in check. "Where does Clyde operate from? How do you contact him?" "I don't know," she insisted, her voice rising. "He calls me. I don't call him. He doesn't tell me anything." Ben stepped closer, his tone icy. "You're lying, and every second you waste means more danger for that boy." The woman looked down, her fingers digging into the fabric of the couch. He has a place, A warehouse near the old docks on Briar Lane. That's all I know. I swear. Ben pressed his radio again, relaying the new information. Suspect mentions possible location near Briar Lane docks, requesting units to converge for investigation. Backup would arrive soon, but Ben couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. Turning back to Rena, he knelt beside her again. "Rena," he said, his voice softer now, "you've been so brave. I need you to be just a little braver, okay? We're going to find Denzel, but I need you to stay here with the officers who are coming to help." Rena's eyes filled with tears again, but she nodded. "Promise you'll bring him back." Ben placed a hand over his heart. "I promise." Moments later, the sound of sirens filled the air as backup units arrived. Ben briefed them quickly, handing the woman over to another officer to be taken into custody. The information she had given would be verified later, but for now, Ben's priority was clear: finding Denzel. The docks at Briar Lane were a notorious part of town, a shadowy area filled with abandoned warehouses and hidden dangers. As Ben drove toward the location, his mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. He couldn't shake the image of Rena's tear-streaked face, the trust in her eyes when she had asked him to bring her brother back. Arriving at the docks, Ben was joined by 2 other patrol cars. The officers fanned out, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they approached the warehouse in question. The building loomed ominously, its broken windows and rusted doors a testament to years of neglect. "Stay sharp," Ben instructed his team, his voice low. "If Clyde's here, he's not going to come quietly." The officers nodded, their movements cautious as they positioned themselves around the building. Ben pushed the door open slowly, the rusty hinges creaking loudly in the still night. Inside, the air was damp and stale, and the faint hum of machinery echoed in the distance. As they moved deeper into the warehouse, Ben's flashlight beam landed on something that made his heart race: a small shoe, lying abandoned on the concrete floor. It was the same size and style as the ones Rena had described her brother wearing. "Denzel," Ben called out, his voice steady but urgent. "It's Officer Ben. I'm here to help." A faint noise reached his ears, soft, muffled crying. Ben's pulse quickened as he followed the sound, weaving through the maze of crates and machinery. Finally, in the corner of the warehouse, he found him. A young boy curled up in a cage, his tear-streaked face peeking through the metal bars. Ben crouched down, his voice filled with relief. "Denzel, it's okay. I'm here. You're safe now." The boy looked up, his expression a mix of fear and hope. "Rena," he whispered, "is she okay?" "She's safe," Ben assured him. "And she's waiting for you." As Ben worked to free Denzel, footsteps sounded behind him. Turning quickly, he found himself face to face with a burly man holding a crowbar. "Clyde." "You're in the wrong place, officer," Clyde growled, his voice dripping with menace. Ben's hand moved instinctively to his holster. "Drop the weapon," he ordered, his voice firm. "It's over." Clyde smirked, raising the crowbar threateningly. "Not for me. It's not." Before Clyde could strike, the other officers moved in, their weapons drawn. Realizing he was outnumbered, Clyde dropped the crowbar with a loud clang and raised his hands. Ben exhaled, relief washing over him as Clyde was handcuffed and led away. Turning back to Denzel, he gently lifted the boy out of the cage, carrying him to safety. "It's over," he said softly. "You're going home." And for the first time in a long while, Ben felt like he had made a difference, a chance at redemption he hadn't thought possible. The dark network. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the quiet station, casting a sterile glow over Ben's desk as he sat hunched over the files. His mind was consumed with the puzzle before him. The children rescued from the warehouse, the cryptic notes Rena and Denzel had provided, and the mysterious figure, Mr. Knox. The name echoed in his mind like a curse, a shadowy presence that seemed to hover just beyond his grasp. As the hours ticked by, Ben felt the weight of the case grow heavier. Each detail that emerged from the investigation only raised more questions. Clyde, the man they had arrested, had been involved in something far more extensive than a simple kidnapping ring. The evidence pointed to a web of trafficking, smuggling, and possibly even organized crime, all of it connected to someone who went by Mr. Knox. Whoever he was, Knox was the puppet master behind this operation, and Ben knew that time was running out to stop him. Ben leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes as he tried to process the new information. The phone call from earlier that evening had changed everything. Officers had located a burner phone linked to Clyde, and after hours of working with their tech team, the phone's history was slowly being unraveled. A single name had appeared repeatedly in the logs: Knox. As if on cue, a knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Thompson, the lead officer, entered with a grim expression on his face. "Got something for you," Thompson said, his voice low. He handed Ben a stack of papers, a mix of phone records and decrypted messages that had been pulled from the burner. The tech team had worked quickly, and there were already patterns emerging. Ben flipped through the papers, his eyes scanning the messages. Most of them were short, coded messages, simple numbers, letters, and dates, all appearing innocuous at first glance. But then Ben saw it. Amid the chaos of the notes, one message stood out. It was longer than the rest, written in plain text. "Meet at the docks. Bring the package. Knox is waiting." The dock. Ben's pulse quickened. That was the second reference to the docks in as many days. He had just come from there earlier, rescuing Denzel. If Knox was involved, if he was orchestrating this entire operation, then the docks might be his base of operations. But this wasn't just a place to stash victims. It was where deals were made, where goods were exchanged in the shadows. It was where the most dangerous transactions took place. "Get me the address for the docks again," Ben said, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "I need backup, and I need it now. We're going after Mr. Knox." The chill of the evening air was sharp as Ben's patrol car cut through the empty streets. His knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel, his mind running through the possibilities. The dockside area on Briar Lane was a long stretch of abandoned warehouses, dark alleys, and hidden corners. It was a place few people dared to go, let alone linger. Perfect for someone who wanted to remain invisible. But Knox wouldn't be invisible for long, not if Ben had anything to do with it. "Thompson, you there?" Ben radioed as he approached the docks. "Ready to go, Ben." Thompson's voice crackled over the radio. "We've got units staging in position. Let's move." The patrol cars rolled quietly through the narrow streets, their headlights cutting through the fog that had begun to settle along the waterfront. The buildings loomed like silent sentinels, their broken windows and crumbling walls adding to the sense of danger in the air. Ben knew these docks well. He'd walked through them many times before, but tonight felt different. Tonight, he was chasing shadows. As Ben turned a corner, his headlights flashed over a familiar figure standing near the entrance of an old warehouse. It was a man, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark coat that blended with the night. He didn't move as the patrol cars slowed to a stop. Ben's heart raced. This was it. This was Knox. Ben stepped out of the car, his hand instinctively moving to the holster at his side. "You know who I am," he called out, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. "And you know why I'm here." The man didn't respond immediately. He simply turned his head slightly, as if considering Ben. Then, finally, he spoke, his voice low and chilling. "I know who you are, Officer Hartman," the man said. "And I know why you're here, but you're too late." Ben's blood ran cold at the words. He knew it wasn't just an idle threat. Knox had been in control from the start, pulling strings from the shadows. Ben had been chasing ghosts, hoping to catch up. But now, it seemed like the ghosts were ready to fight back. Without warning, the man turned and started walking toward the entrance of the warehouse. His steps were slow and measured, but there was a sense of finality to them. Ben didn't hesitate. He pulled out his gun and advanced, his team following closely behind. "Stop right there," Ben shouted, his voice carrying through the still night air. "Put your hands in the air." Knox didn't even glance back. Instead, he reached for something inside his coat, pulling out a small device that he held in his palm. Ben's instincts flared. It was a detonator. "Don't," Ben said, his voice cracking with a mix of anger and desperation. "Don't make this worse than it has to be." The man's lips curled into a smile, a cruel, almost mocking expression. "You think I care about your laws? You've already lost, Hartman. All your effort, all your little games, pointless. The children are already gone. This whole city will burn because of you." Ben's heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. His eyes darted to his team, signaling them to spread out, but he couldn't tear his gaze away from Knox. Every instinct told him the situation was spiraling into something even more dangerous than he had anticipated. Knox's smile widened, his eyes glittering in the low light. "You'll see soon enough. Just watch." Before Ben could react, Knox pushed a button on the device. The entire area seemed to hum for a brief moment. The ground beneath them shook, a low rumble filling the air. And then, in a flash, the warehouse behind Knox erupted into a series of deafening explosions. Ben's breath caught in his throat as debris flew through the air, sending pieces of concrete, glass, and metal scattering in all directions. The explosion was a calculated move, a final warning, and Ben knew it was meant to send a message. Knox wasn't just trying to escape. He was making sure there was nothing left to find. "Get down," Ben shouted, throwing himself to the ground as pieces of debris rained down. He covered his head, the force of the blast making the earth tremble beneath him. In the chaos, Knox vanished into the darkness, leaving only the burning remains of the warehouse behind. As the smoke cleared and the sirens of the emergency responders grew louder, Ben pulled himself to his feet. His ears were ringing, and his heart pounded in his chest. He could hear the shouts of his officers as they scrambled to assess the damage. But his mind was elsewhere, focused on the chilling words Knox had left behind. "You've already lost." The city was in greater danger than Ben had ever imagined. The bomb was only a diversion, a warning that Knox was prepared to do whatever it took to keep his empire intact. The children they had rescued, Raina, Denzel, and the others, were just pawns in a much larger game. As Ben surveyed the destruction, a deep, visceral anger gripped him. He couldn't let Knox get away with this. Not again. Not this time. Ben knew that the clock was ticking, and if he didn't act fast, the lives of countless innocent children could be lost forever. With his jaw clenched, Ben turned to his team. "We're not done yet. We've got a lot of ground to cover, and we're going to bring him down." He could feel the weight of the city's fate on his shoulders. But one thing was certain. He wasn't going to stop until Knox was caught, no matter the cost. Into the shadows, the cold wind cut through the night as Ben stood at the epicenter of the destruction, watching as the emergency crews moved in to assess the damage. The warehouse was now nothing more than a smoldering pile of rubble, the flames from the explosion licking the air, casting eerie shadows on the ground. Ben could still feel the sting of the blast on his skin, but his mind was racing, processing everything Knox had said. "You've already lost." Those words echoed in his mind like a warning, a signal that Knox was always one step ahead. The explosion, the way Knox had disappeared without hesitation, made it clear that he wasn't just a criminal mastermind. He was a man who had thought through every possible move, a man who wasn't afraid of consequences because he had already planned for them. Ben clenched his fists, his heart pounding in his chest. He had promised Raina and Denzel that he would protect them, that he would put an end to the horrors they had endured. But now, the stakes were higher than ever. Knox wasn't just an isolated threat. He was part of a larger operation, one that spanned across the city and likely beyond. Ben couldn't afford to let this slip through his fingers. Not when so many lives were at stake. "Ben, you okay?" Thompson's voice cut through the haze of smoke and confusion. The lead officer approached, his face grim, eyes scanning the wreckage. "I'm fine," Ben said, his voice low but steady. "But we need to move fast. We're dealing with something much bigger than we thought. Knox has resources, influence, and a network that we've barely scratched the surface of. This explosion, it's just a warning." Thompson nodded, pulling out his phone. "I'll get our forensics team on this. Maybe we can find something in the rubble, anything that might lead us to him." Ben shook his head. "We don't have time for that. We've got to think bigger. Knox is connected to everything. The children, the trafficking, the disappearances, all of it. He's smart, and he's always thinking 2 steps ahead of us." Thompson was silent for a moment, his eyes still scanning the horizon as though trying to make sense of what had just happened. "So what's the next move?" "We go after his network," Ben replied, his voice filled with determination. "The warehouse was just one part of the puzzle, but Knox is pulling strings all over the city. We need to trace his connections, find out who's working for him, where he's operating, and what his ultimate goal is." "I'll pull the team together," Thompson said, already dialing his phone. "We'll start with everything we know. Clyde's ledger, the burner phone records, anything we can track down." Ben nodded, his thoughts racing. He knew the investigation was going to be a long, difficult road, but they couldn't afford to waste time. Knox's empire wasn't going to crumble by itself. Ben had seen enough in his years on the force to understand that. Criminals like Knox didn't just vanish. They left traces, no matter how careful they were. Ben just had to find them before Knox could cover his tracks completely. By morning, the team had regrouped at the station. Ben sat in the small conference room, the walls lined with maps, photos, and evidence from the night before. Thompson, the lead investigator, and several other officers were gathered around the table, reviewing the information they had gathered so far. "We've been through Clyde's phone records," Thompson began, his voice serious. "The calls to Knox are frequent, but there's no direct connection to an actual address or location, just random burner phones. He's good at hiding his tracks. But we did find something interesting. One of the messages on the burner phone referenced a shipping container, something about delivering a package to a location in the docks." Ben's eyes narrowed. A shipping container. That could be a lead. A big one. If Knox was using shipping containers to move people, that meant he had a network, a logistics system that spanned far beyond just this city. Ben knew that these kinds of operations often had international connections. If they could find one of those containers, they might uncover Knox's larger network. "We need to find that." Into the shadows. The sounds of the sirens were a distant hum in Ben's ears as he surveyed the chaos unfolding inside the storage unit. The criminals had been disarmed and handcuffed, their faces a mix of confusion and fear. Their plan had been shattered in the blink of an eye, but Ben knew that this was just a small part of a far larger operation. He could see it in the way they scrambled, in the hollow look in their eyes. These were men who were used to being part of something bigger. Knox's network had grown deep roots, and they had just uprooted a small branch of it. Ben's eyes flicked over to the cages lining the back wall of the unit. There were at least a dozen children huddled together, some as young as 6 or 7, their wide eyes staring at him with a mixture of fear and confusion. They were thin, dirty, and looked as though they hadn't seen daylight in days, perhaps weeks. Each cage was locked with a thick metal latch, and Ben felt a surge of guilt wash over him as he saw the tiny hands reaching through the bars, desperate for the safety they had been denied. Without hesitation, Ben moved to the nearest cage. He could see the terror in the children's faces, children who were supposed to be protected, supposed to have a chance at life. But here they were, trapped in a nightmare created by a man who didn't care about their lives, about their futures. They were just commodities to be sold, to be moved in the dark. Hey, you're safe now," Ben said softly, his voice steady as he unlocked the first cage. The little girl inside, no older than 7, blinked up at him with wide, frightened eyes, her small body trembling. "It's okay. We're getting you out of here." The girl said nothing, her lips trembling as she stepped out of the cage. She clung to Ben's side, her small frame fitting perfectly against his, a desperate need for security and safety radiating off her. Ben gently led her out of the storage unit toward the officers waiting outside. He couldn't look back at the others just yet. He needed to get her to safety, away from the horrors of the warehouse, the facility, the monsters who had put her here. One by one, the officers cleared the cages, releasing the children. The whole scene felt surreal. Ben's mind kept circling back to Knox. How long had he been running this operation? How many children had he trafficked in the span of his reign? And why? The questions burned in Ben's mind. But for now, the only thing that mattered was getting these children away from this place. The answers would come later, but they would come. As the last child was freed, Ben stepped back into the unit, his eyes scanning the area once again for any sign of information that could point to Knox's next move. The space was cluttered, with boxes stacked high and shipping materials scattered across the floor. Amidst the chaos, Ben spotted something. A large map pinned to the wall, marked with red pins and crisscrossing lines. It was a network, locations, destinations, and routes all drawn out meticulously. A series of warehouses, storage units, and docks, all marked with code numbers that matched some of the numbers in the ledger they had found from Clyde's phone. Knox's operation wasn't just confined to this city. It stretched across borders, through ports, and into places Ben could barely fathom. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Knox was far more dangerous than he had anticipated. He wasn't just a criminal. He was a kingpin with connections, money, power, a shadow who moved unseen in the dark. He took a photo of the map with his phone, his mind racing. This was the key. If they could trace these routes, follow the flow of shipments, they might just be able to take down the entire network. Ben turned back to the kids, watching as the officers escorted them out of the facility, some of them still too stunned to speak. There were more children here, but for now, the immediate danger was over. The officers would take them to safety, take them somewhere they could begin to heal. But for Ben, the weight of the next step was already pressing on him. Back at the station, the team was already hard at work. The children had been sent to a safe house, their identities being protected as they began the long process of recovery. The social workers, child advocates, and medical professionals were all briefed and ready to help. For the first time in a while, Ben felt a flicker of hope, a small spark that maybe, just maybe, they were starting to win. But even that spark couldn't quiet the storm of questions swirling in his mind. Knox wasn't a man who could be easily cornered. They had just discovered the outer layers of his operation, but the core of it was still hidden. Ben needed answers, and to get them, he had to be one step ahead. He sat at his desk, reviewing the photos of the map, trying to make sense of the routes and connections. There was one address that stood out to him, a remote location far outside the city, near the coast. It wasn't marked on the same level as the other points. It was highlighted in a different color, almost as if it were special. Ben zoomed in on the map, his finger tracing the route. There were no immediate markings, but he knew enough to recognize the pattern. This place wasn't just a shipping point. It was likely a headquarters. He picked up the phone and dialed Thompson's number. "We need to go back," Ben said when Thompson answered. "There's one more location we need to check. This one's different." The drive to the coast was long and silent, the air thick with the weight of what they were about to walk into. Ben's thoughts kept returning to the children they had saved, to the faces of the ones who were too young to understand the nightmare they had just escaped. But even more pressing was the thought of Knox. The man was like a ghost, slipping through their fingers at every turn. If he was holed up at this location, they couldn't afford to waste any more time. The coastline was desolate, the gray sky blending into the turbulent waves crashing against the rocky shore. The facility stood in stark contrast to its surroundings, an industrial complex that looked as though it had been abandoned for years, yet something about it felt alive. Ben's gut tightened. This was it. This was where Knox had made his final stand. The team parked a few hundred yards from the complex, their cars hidden from view behind a line of dunes. Ben motioned for the officers to move silently, their steps muffled by the sand beneath their boots. He kept his eyes on the building, his breath steady as his fingers brushed the grip of his gun. They couldn't afford to underestimate what lay ahead. As they approached, Ben could see figures moving behind the windows, men guarding the complex, shadows passing by as they kept watch. They knew someone was coming. They had to. Knox wasn't an amateur. Ben glanced at his team, nodding. This was their best chance to catch Knox before he could vanish into the ether once again. They moved in, creeping closer to the entrance. Ben's thoughts were sharp, every muscle in his body tense with the knowledge that the next few moments could change everything. Inside, Knox was waiting, but not for long. This time, Ben would be ready. The final game. The wind was bitterly cold as Ben and his team approached the industrial complex by the coast, their movements silent but urgent. The air smelled of salt and decay, the heavy mist from the sea hanging low over the rocky ground. The distant crash of waves against jagged rocks echoed in the background, an ominous soundtrack to the danger that lay ahead. Ben's heart was pounding, not just from the adrenaline, but from the realization that they were walking into the belly of the beast. This was it, the final confrontation. The building loomed ahead, a rusted relic of a past era, its windows shattered and its metal doors barely hanging on their hinges. It looked deserted, but Ben knew better. Knox was no fool. He was always one step ahead. Every move they made was being watched, every plan anticipated. And yet this time, Ben wasn't going to let him slip through his fingers. He couldn't afford to. As Ben signaled to his team to surround the complex, the team moved with practiced precision, splitting into smaller groups to cover every possible exit. Their steps were muffled by the shifting sand beneath their boots, but the sense of urgency and the tension in the air were palpable. There was no turning back now. Ben's thoughts kept flickering back to the children they had rescued from the storage unit, their faces still haunting his memory. He had promised to protect them, to make sure they could live the lives they deserved. That promise was now more important than ever, because if they failed tonight, Knox's network would only grow stronger. More children would disappear. More lives would be ruined. He motioned for Thompson to approach, his voice barely above a whisper. "We're moving in," he said, his eyes scanning the perimeter. "We don't know what we're walking into. Stay sharp." Thompson nodded, his face set in determination. "Understood. Let's bring this bastard down." The team entered the complex through a side entrance, the metal door groaning in protest as they pushed it open. The interior was dark, the faint smell of oil and rust in the air. The walls were bare, save for some peeling paint and scattered debris. It felt abandoned, empty. But Ben had learned not to trust appearances. They moved cautiously through the darkened hallways, the sound of their footsteps muted against the concrete floor. Ben's hand rested lightly on the gun at his side, ready for anything. Every corridor they passed seemed identical, long, narrow, and winding. There were no windows, no signs of life, just the oppressive silence. But Ben could feel it. Something was off. They were being led down this path, drawn deeper into the maze, exactly where Knox wanted them. As they turned another corner, the hairs on the back of Ben's neck stood on end. Ahead, a faint light flickered under a door. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Knox was here, and this was his final game. Ben raised his hand, signaling for the team to stop. He motioned to Thompson and two other officers to flank the door, while he approached from the front. There was no time to waste. The door was heavy, but it didn't seem to be locked. It opened with a low creak, and Ben stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room. The sight before him was worse than he had imagined. The room was vast, a large open space filled with rows of tables covered in equipment. On the far side of the room, a group of men stood around a table, talking in hushed voices. But it wasn't the men that caught Ben's attention. It was the large screen mounted on the wall. The screen was filled with images of the very children they had rescued, their faces plastered across the monitors. But these weren't just photos. They were part of a live feed. Ben's stomach twisted. Knox wasn't just running an operation. He was orchestrating a show, turning human lives into a product to be sold, broadcasted for the world to see. "Ben," Thompson whispered, his voice tight with anger. "This is worse than we thought." Ben didn't respond. He was too focused on the man standing in front of the screen, a man in a black suit, his back turned to them. It was Knox. The room was eerily quiet now, as if the entire building had gone still in anticipation. Knox turned slowly, his face appearing on the screen. His smile was cold, calculating. A man who knew the game he was playing. "I've been expecting you," Knox said, his voice smooth and controlled. "You're persistent. I'll give you that." Ben's jaw tightened. "This ends tonight, Knox. You've taken too many lives, ruined too many families. We're here to put a stop to it." Knox chuckled softly, his gaze flicking between Ben and the team. "You think you can just walk in here and stop me? This isn't just a business. It's a movement. I've built something much bigger than you can understand. You can't stop it, no matter how hard you try." Ben's hand tightened around his gun. "We've already stopped a lot of it. And we'll stop the rest." Knox's eyes glinted with amusement. "You're not as smart as you think, officer. You see, this was never about the children. This was always about control, power, the ability to make people disappear, to shape the world to my will. And you're just a small obstacle in my path." Ben's heart hammered in his chest. Knox's words weren't just empty threats. They were the truth. Knox wasn't interested in money or wealth. He wanted something far more dangerous. He wanted control over people, over entire systems. He had a hand in governments, businesses, and the lives of thousands of people. Ben had stumbled into a war that would only get worse from here on out. But Ben wasn't backing down. "I'm not here to play your game, Knox," Ben said, his voice low and steady. "I'm here to end it." With a flick of his hand, Knox gestured to the men in the room, who immediately reached for their weapons. But Ben was faster. Shots rang out, echoing through the room as the officers moved in, taking down Knox's men with swift, precise movements. The chaos was a blur. Gunfire, shouting, the sound of footsteps, the sudden flash of lights as Ben ducked behind a pillar for cover. He could hear Knox's voice over the commotion, a sneer in his words. "You'll never stop me," Knox shouted, his voice growing louder. "You can't kill an idea." Ben didn't answer. He moved swiftly, dodging behind crates, his eyes locked on Knox as the man made his way to a back door. Ben could feel the anger surging through him, the need to end this once and for all. He wasn't going to let Knox get away. Not this time. Knox reached for the door, his hand hovering over the knob. Ben was already there, stepping into his line of sight. "Move, Hartman," Knox hissed. "You won't win. This is bigger than you." Without a word, Ben lunged, tackling Knox to the ground. The force knocked the wind out of Knox, but he wasn't finished yet. He struggled, trying to break free, but Ben held him down with a strength born from years of pain, of loss. "This ends now," Ben said, his voice hard as steel. The sirens outside grew louder, and Ben could feel the rush of victory flooding through him. Knox was finally caught, his network shattered, his empire crumbling. But as the officers moved in to restrain Knox and secure the building, Ben knew the real work had just begun. They had stopped one man, but the power he wielded ran deep, through systems, through people, through the very fabric of society. Ben stood over Knox, his chest heaving with exertion. "This is just the beginning," Ben said, locking eyes with the defeated man on the ground. And I'll be there every step of the way until it's all over." With that, the doors of the complex slammed shut, and the long fight to dismantle Knox's empire had truly begun. But for the first time in a long while, Ben felt a small but powerful sense of hope. They had won this battle, and that meant they could win the war. The unraveling. The aftershocks of the raid still reverberated through Ben's mind as he stood in the stark, sterile conference room at the police station. Knox was behind bars, but Ben knew this was only the beginning. The explosion of the warehouse, the network of criminals Knox had set in motion, and the children he had trafficked. It was a weight that pressed down on Ben's chest. He'd taken down the figurehead, but the ripple effect would be felt for years to come. Ben rubbed his temples, trying to push past the exhaustion that gnawed at him. He hadn't slept in days, the adrenaline from the raid still surging in his veins. But he couldn't afford to rest, not when they were so close to unraveling the full extent of Knox's operations. The man might be captured, but the empire he built, the web of corruption, extended far beyond what anyone had realized. And with Knox in custody, there was a sense of urgency that gripped Ben like a vice. His thoughts kept returning to the children, Raina, Denzel, and all the others who had been lost in the dark. They had been saved, yes, but for how long? How many more were still out there, waiting to be discovered? And how many had been forever erased from the world, swallowed by a system so vast and hidden that no one could see it coming? The thought of it made Ben's blood run cold. Thompson entered the room, his face drawn and serious. The manila folder he carried seemed too small to contain everything they had uncovered so far, but it was all Ben had to go on. Thompson set it on the table in front of him, his eyes meeting Ben's. "We've got some answers," Thompson said, his voice low, as though speaking the words out loud made them more real. The tech team went through Knox's files. Encrypted data, coded messages, everything. He wasn't just working in the shadows of our city. His reach extended far beyond that. Ben's eyes narrowed as he looked down at the folder. "Where?" Thompson's voice grew darker. "We're talking international networks. Mexico, Eastern Europe, parts of the Middle East. There are connections in every corner of the world. The trafficking was just the start. Knox had bigger plans. Human trafficking, weapons smuggling, money laundering. He was building something global." Ben's stomach tightened. He had known that Knox's reach went far beyond the city's limits, but hearing it laid out so plainly made it more real. Ben leaned forward, scanning the papers in front of him. "There's a name that keeps coming up in the files," Thompson continued, his voice strained. "A man known as the broker. We think he's the one who supplied Knox with most of his resources. Connections to weapons dealers, access to international shipping lanes, that sort of thing. Knox was the face, but the broker is the hand pulling the strings." Ben clenched his fists. The broker. Another shadow, another piece of the puzzle. If Knox had been a kingpin, the broker was the kingmaker. He had the connections, the money, and the network to keep the operation running smoothly. And if Ben was going to take down the entire operation, he needed to find him. "How do we get to him?" Ben asked, his voice low and steady. Thompson flipped through the papers, his fingers stopping on a particular page. "We've got a lead. It's tenuous, but it's something. There's an encrypted message here that was sent just before Knox was arrested. It's an address in Barcelona. We think it's a meeting spot for the broker, and whoever else is involved in Knox's operations." Ben stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. His mind raced as he thought through their next steps. "We go there. We hit them fast. Hit them hard." Thompson nodded. "We've got a team ready. But Ben, there's something you need to know. This could go a lot deeper than just Knox and the broker. We've been looking into some of the people who've been moving through these operations. There are high-profile names, government officials, business magnates, even people within law enforcement. People who are so embedded that taking them down will take more than just an arrest." Ben's heart skipped a beat. "Corruption?" he asked, the word thick on his tongue. Not just corruption, Thompson replied, his eyes hard. Collusion. You're not just dealing with a criminal network anymore. You're dealing with a system that's been rotting from the inside out. And if we go after it, we're going to make some enemies in very high places. Ben's breath hitched in his chest. He had always known that the fight against people like Knox would have its dangers. But this was something entirely different. They were no longer fighting just for justice. They were fighting for the future of the system itself. Then we burn it down, Ben said, his voice filled with resolve. We expose them all. The flight to Barcelona was a blur. The usual mundane procedures of travel, the small discomforts of cramped seats, the endless hours of waiting, felt insignificant compared to what awaited them. Ben couldn't stop thinking about the files, the addresses, the names that had appeared in Knox's encrypted messages. Each one was a piece of a larger puzzle, a puzzle that seemed to stretch beyond the city, beyond the country. The closer they got to their destination, the heavier the weight on Ben's chest became. He thought of Raina, of Denzel, of every child they had saved, and every child still out there. He thought of the people who had been taken, who had disappeared without a trace, their names erased by the people who ran these operations. Ben had never felt the magnitude of his responsibility more keenly than he did now. If they didn't stop Knox, if they didn't expose the broker, there would be more victims, more lives destroyed in the name of profit, power, and control. Ben glanced at Thompson as the plane began its descent into Barcelona. When we get there, we move fast, no hesitation. Understood, Thompson said, his voice as steady as ever. We hit hard and clean. By the time they touched down, it was clear that this wasn't just another investigation. This was an all-out war. Barcelona, with its sprawling streets and historical beauty, now felt like a battlefield. They had no guarantees, no assurances that the broker would be there when they arrived. But they had to act quickly. The team made their way through the city, the tight streets filled with noise and motion. Barcelona's famed architecture loomed overhead, but Ben barely noticed it. His mind was focused on the task ahead. Find the broker, expose the network, and finally bring an end to the suffering that had been allowed to thrive in the shadows for so long. They arrived at the address, a nondescript building in a quiet corner of the city. It looked harmless, even abandoned, but Ben's gut told him otherwise. Every instinct screamed that they were close. Move in, Ben said, his voice low. His team spread out, positioning themselves in and around the building. Ben's heart pounded as he moved toward the door, his hand on his gun. It wasn't just a raid. This was personal. As they entered, Ben's eyes scanned the room. There was a small group of men sitting around a table, heavyset, disheveled, not the typical kind of criminals he had dealt with before. These men were scared. Ben could feel the shift in the air as they caught sight of him. And then the door slammed shut. A voice echoed from the shadows, calm, confident. Well, look who decided to join the party. Ben's heart skipped a beat. The broker was here, and the final game had begun.